The rain drummed against the windows of Bella Vista, Portland's most prestigious Italian restaurant, as I adjusted my black tie for the 100th time that evening. My hands trembled slightly, not from the cold Oregon December air, but from anticipation. Night wasn't just another shift. It was the night my entire family would finally see where I worked. "Marcus, Table 7 needs their wine," called Sarah, my fellow server, rushing past with a tray of steaming osso buco. I nodded, straightening my posture. At 28, I'd been working at Bella Vista for 3 years, and I genuinely loved it. The restaurant buzzed with energy every night, wealthy tech executives celebrating deals, anniversary couples sharing intimate moments, and food critics scribbling notes between bites of our renowned truffle pasta. But tonight felt different. Tonight, my family was here. I spotted them immediately at our corner table overlooking the city lights. Dad sat at the head, his weathered contractor's hands folded neatly on the white tablecloth. Mom fussed with her pearl necklace, the one she only wore for special occasions. And there was David, my older brother, checking his phone while his wife Jennifer studied the wine list with that calculating look she got when spending someone else's money. David looked exactly like what he was, a successful software executive at Nike's headquarters. His tailored suit probably cost more than I made in a month, and his Rolex caught the restaurant's ambient lighting perfectly. At 32, he owned a house in Lake Oswego, drove a Tesla, and never let anyone forget about his 6-figure salary. "Good evening. I'm Marcus, and I'll be taking care of you tonight," I said, approaching their table with practiced professionalism. Mum's face lit up. "Sweetheart, you look so handsome in that uniform." "It's not a uniform, Mum. It's professional attire," I corrected gently, pulling out my notepad. "Can I start you with some appetizers? Our burrata is exceptional tonight." David barely looked up from his phone. "Just bring us a bottle of your most expensive Barolo, and make it quick. I have calls to make." "David, put that phone away," Dad said firmly. "We're here to celebrate Marcus." "Celebrate what exactly?" David finally looked up, his eyes scanning my server's outfit with barely concealed disdain. "That he's still slinging pasta at 30. The words stung, but I maintained my composure. "I'm 28 and I happen to love working here. Bella Vista is one of Portland's—" "Love it?" David interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Marcus, you're a waiter. You take orders and carry plates. When are you going to get a real job?" Jennifer placed a manicured hand on David's arm. "Honey, maybe we should—" "No, seriously," David continued, his voice carrying to nearby tables. "I'm trying to understand the career trajectory here. You've got a college degree, Marcus. Remember, the one Mom and Dad sacrificed to pay for, and you're using it to— what? Recommend wine pairings?" My face burned with embarrassment. I could feel other diners glancing our way. Sarah shot me a sympathetic look from across the room, but there was nothing she could do. Dad cleared his throat. "That's enough, David." "Is it, though?" David leaned back in his chair, warming to his theme. "Sarah and I were just talking about this in the car. We're buying our second investment property next month, Dad. Meanwhile, Marcus is still renting that studio apartment downtown, serving other people's food. There's dignity in honest work," Mom said quietly, but her voice lacked conviction. David laughed, not a pleasant sound. "Dignity? Mom, he's a waiter. Not the restaurant owner, not the chef, not even the manager. Just a waiter. When people ask what my brother does for living, what am I supposed to say?" The restaurant noise seemed to fade around us. I felt exposed, diminished, like David had stripped away everything I'd built about myself and left me standing naked in front of everyone who mattered. "You know what?" I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Let me get someone else to take care of your table tonight." "Marcus, wait." Mom reached for my arm, but I was already walking away. I found myself in the restaurant's walk-in cooler, the cold air shocking my overheated face. 3 years of building confidence, 3 years of telling myself that I was happy, that I was building something meaningful, all of it crumbled in the span of 5 minutes. But as I stood there among the hanging prosciutto and wheels of aged Parmesan, something else began to burn inside me. Not just embarrassment, anger. Pure, crystalline anger. Tony Marcelli, the restaurant's owner, found me there 10 minutes later. At 65, Tony had built Bella Vista from nothing, and his presence commanded respect from everyone who worked there. "Rough table?" he asked, his Brooklyn accent still strong after 40 years in Oregon. "My family," I said simply. Tony nodded knowingly. "Family can be the hardest customers. Listen, kid. Why don't you take the rest of the night off? Sarah can handle your section." I looked at this man, who'd given me a chance when other restaurants wouldn't even interview me. Tony saw potential in people, saw their worth beyond their current circumstances. "Tony," I said suddenly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Hypothetically speaking, what would it take to buy this place?" He raised an eyebrow. "You thinking about a career change?" "Maybe. What would something like this cost?" Tony was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. "Hypothetically, with the property, equipment, reputation, and current revenue streams, probably around 800,000 to $1 million. Why? $800,000. The number hit me like a physical blow, but instead of discouraging me, it crystallized something in my mind. "Just curious," I said. But I wasn't just curious. As I walked out of Bella Vista that night, past the table where my family was probably discussing my dramatic exit, a plan began forming. It was crazy, probably impossible, but it was mine. David thought I was just a waiter. In 1 week, I was going to prove him spectacularly wrong. The Portland rain had stopped, and the city lights reflected off the wet pavement like stars. I pulled out my phone and started making calls. If I was going to do this, I needed help, and I needed it fast. My first call was to my old college roommate Jake, who now worked in commercial real estate. My second was to my cousin Maria, who'd started 3 successful businesses before she turned 30. My third was to someone I hadn't spoken to in 5 years, my former mentor from business school, Professor Elizabeth Chen. By the time I reached my studio apartment, I had meetings scheduled for the next 3 days and a burning determination that surprised even me. "Just a waiter," I said to my reflection in the bathroom mirror. "We'll see about that." The next morning arrived with typical Portland drizzle, but I was already dressed and caffeinated by 6 a.m. My studio apartment, which David had so eloquently mocked, suddenly felt different, not like a limitation, but like a launching pad. I'd spent the night researching everything I could about restaurant acquisitions, business loans, and Tony Marcelli's financial history. My first meeting was with Jake Morrison at 8 a.m. We'd been roommates at Oregon State, where he'd studied business while I pursued my degree in hospitality management. Now he worked for Portland Commercial Properties, one of the city's most successful real estate firms. "Marcus Thompson," Jake grinned as I walked into the coffee shop near Pioneer Square. "You look terrible. What's this emergency about?" I slid into the booth across from him, noting how his expensive suit contrasted with my jeans and sweater. "Everyone seemed to be doing better than me lately. I need to buy a restaurant," I said without preamble. Jake nearly choked on his espresso. "I'm sorry, what?" "Bella Vista, the Italian place on Northwest 23rd. I need to know everything about its finances, its property value, and what it would take to make an offer." "Marcus," Jake set down his cup carefully, "that place is worth close to $1 million. Do you have that kind of money?" "Not yet, but I will." For the next hour, I laid out everything I'd learned about Bella Vista. Tony had mentioned he was considering retirement. His wife wanted to move to Arizona to be closer to their grandchildren. The restaurant was profitable, but required the kind of hands-on management that was wearing on a 65-year-old man. Jake listened carefully, occasionally taking notes on his tablet. Okay, let's say Tony is interested in selling. You'd need at least 20% down. That's $200,000 minimum, plus closing costs, inspection fees, legal fees. You're looking at $250,000 just to get in the door. $250,000. I had exactly $12,000 in savings. What about investor financing? I asked. Possible, but you'd need to prove the restaurant's profitability and show that you have the experience to run it successfully. Being a server doesn't exactly scream restaurant management experience to most banks. It was a fair point, but I wasn't deterred. What would strengthen my position? Jake leaned forward, his expression serious. Honestly, you'd need a comprehensive business plan, financial projections for at least 5 years, letters of recommendation from industry professionals, and proof that you understand every aspect of restaurant operations, not just the front of house. I spent the rest of the morning in the Portland State University Library, researching everything I could about restaurant management, food costs, labor optimization, and profit margins. By lunch, my head was spinning with numbers, but I was beginning to see the full scope of what I was attempting. My 2 p.m. meeting was with my cousin Maria at her downtown office. Maria Gonzalez had started a food truck business at 25, sold it for a profit 2 years later, then launched a successful catering company and a boutique marketing firm. At 33, she was exactly the kind of entrepreneur I needed to talk to. You want to do what in a week? Maria stared at me across her glass desk, her expression somewhere between admiration and concern. Buy Bella Vista. I know it sounds impossible. It doesn't sound impossible, Marcus. It sounds insane. She leaned back in her chair, studying me. Tell me why this matters so much. I found myself explaining the dinner, David's words, the humiliation I'd felt. But as I talked, I realized it went deeper than that. For 3 years, I'd been telling myself I was happy at Bella Vista, but the truth was, I'd been hiding from my potential, from taking risks, from proving to myself that I could build something meaningful. So this is about proving your brother wrong? Maria asked. At first, maybe, but now I think it's about proving myself right. Maria was quiet for a long moment. Okay. Let's say I help you. What's your plan for financing? I pulled out the notebook where I'd been scribbling ideas all morning. SBA loan for part of it. Maybe find private investors for the rest. I was hoping you might know people who invest in restaurants. I might, she said carefully. But Marcus, investors want to see returns. They're not going to fund your emotional journey. You need to show them how you're going to make this place more profitable than it already is. That stopped me short. I'd been so focused on buying the restaurant that I hadn't really considered what I'd do differently once I owned it. What do you think Bella Vista's weaknesses are? Maria asked. I thought about my 3 years there, about the complaints I'd heard, the inefficiencies I'd noticed. Limited lunch business. We're only busy at dinner. The private dining room is underutilized. And Tony's been resistant to social media marketing or online ordering. Maria nodded approvingly. Now you're thinking like an owner. What else? The wine program could be expanded. We have great relationships with local suppliers, but we're not showcasing Oregon wines enough. And I hesitated, then pushed forward. Honestly, some of the staff have gotten complacent. Tony's too nice to make hard decisions about underperformers. Good. That's the kind of insight investors want to hear. Maria pulled out her phone. I'm going to make some calls, but Marcus, you need to understand, even if we find financing, you're talking about risking everything. If this fails, you won't just lose the restaurant. You'll be buried in debt for years. The weight of that settled over me like a cold blanket. But when I thought about David's smug face, about the way he'd dismissed 3 years of my life in front of our entire family, the fear transformed into determination. I understand, I said. My final meeting of the day was at 6 p.m. with Professor Elizabeth Chen. She'd been my favorite instructor in business school, a tough woman in her 50s who'd run several successful restaurants before transitioning to academia. I'd emailed her that morning, and she'd agreed to meet me at her office. "Marcus," she smiled as I entered her cluttered office overlooking the campus. "It's been too long. I hear you're working at Bella Vista, Tony Marcelli's place. You know Tony? I know everyone in Portland's restaurant scene. Tony's a good man, old school. His food is excellent, but he's never been much of a businessman." She gestured for me to sit. "Your email was intriguing but vague. What's this about?" I explained my plan again, watching her face carefully for reactions. Professor Chen had a poker face that revealed nothing, but she took notes as I talked. "Ambitious," she said when I finished. "Probably foolish, definitely risky." She paused. "When can you talk to Tony?" "You think I should?" "I think you should find out if he's actually interested in selling before you turn your life upside down chasing this dream." She leaned forward. "But Marcus, if you're serious about this, you need to understand something. Buying a restaurant isn't the hard part. Running one successfully is. Are you prepared for 18-hour days, constant stress, and the very real possibility of failure? I thought about my comfortable life as a server. Regular hours, decent tips, no real responsibility beyond taking orders and keeping customers happy. What I was contemplating would change everything." "Yes," I said, and meant it. Professor Chen smiled for the first time that evening. "Good, then let's make a plan." We spent the next 2 hours outlining what I'd need. A comprehensive business plan, financial projections, a transition strategy, and most importantly, a conversation with Tony about his intentions. By the time I left her office, I had a timeline. 3 days to prepare a preliminary business plan, 2 days to secure preliminary financing commitments, and then the conversation with Tony that would determine whether this was possible or just an expensive fantasy. Walking back to my apartment through downtown Portland, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine excitement about my future. The city looked different somehow, full of possibilities instead of limitations. I called in sick the next day. The first time I'd ever done that at Bella Vista, and spent 14 hours at my kitchen table, building spreadsheets and writing business plans. By midnight, I had the foundation of something that might actually work. But as I finally crawled into bed, one thought kept nagging at me. In 5 days, I'd have to face Tony and make my pitch. Everything depended on his response. And somewhere across town, David was probably sleeping peacefully in his Lake Oswego mansion, completely unaware that his waiter brother was about to attempt something that would either prove him spectacularly wrong or spectacularly right. Thursday morning arrived with unprecedented sunshine for December in Portland. I took it as a good omen as I walked into the offices of Pacific Northwest Bank at exactly 9 a.m., carrying a leather portfolio that contained 3 days of obsessive work. My loan officer was Janet Martinez, a woman in her early 40s who'd somehow managed to schedule me for a preliminary consultation despite my complete lack of collateral. Maria had made the introduction. Apparently, Janet had financed 2 of Maria's previous ventures. "Mr. Thompson," Janet reviewed my application with the kind of professional skepticism I was learning to appreciate. "You're applying for a $700,000 SBA loan to purchase a restaurant where you currently work as a server." "That's correct. And your current annual income is $37,000. The number sounded even smaller when spoken aloud in this oak-paneled office. Janet set down my application and leaned back in her chair. "Help me understand why we should consider this loan." For the next 45 minutes, I presented everything I'd learned about Bella Vista's operations, its potential for growth, and my plans for increasing profitability. I'd memorized every number, every projection, every detail of my business plan. "Your research is thorough," Janet admitted, "and your growth projections are realistic. I've seen too many restaurant plans that promise to triple revenue in year 1. But Marcus, your biggest obstacle is experience. Banks don't typically lend $750,000 to first-time restaurant owners. What would strengthen my application? Co-signers with significant assets, industry references who can vouch for your management potential, and honestly, some proof that the current owner is actually willing to sell to you. And I left the bank with a conditional pre-approval letter, conditional on meeting about 15 different requirements, including the one Janet had emphasized, Tony's willingness to sell. My phone buzzed as I reached the sidewalk. A text from Maria. Meet me at Stumptown Coffee on Division. Bring your business plan. I found Maria at a corner table with a man I didn't recognize. Tall, mid-40s, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that somehow looked expensive. He had the kind of casual confidence that suggested significant wealth. Marcus, this is David Chen, no relation to your professor. He owns 3 restaurants in Seattle and invests in food service businesses. David Chen stood to shake my hand, his grip firm and assessing. Maria says you want to buy Bella Vista. That's Tony Marcelli's place, right? You know it. I know Tony. Good man, great food, terrible businessman. He gestured for me to sit. I've been watching that place for 2 years, wondering when Tony would finally decide to retire. For the next hour, I walked David through my business plan while he asked increasingly detailed questions about everything from food costs to labor scheduling. Unlike the bank officer, he seemed less concerned with my lack of experience and more interested in my understanding of the restaurant's operations. Your lunch expansion plan is solid, he said finally. Portland's downtown lunch scene is underserved, and Bella Vista's location could capture a lot of business district traffic. But your marketing budget is too low, and you're underestimating the cost of equipment upgrades. He pulled out his phone and spent several minutes making calculations. Here's what I'll offer. I'll invest $200,000 for a 30% stake in the business. That gives you the down payment you need, plus working capital for improvements. $200,000. Just like that, my impossible plan suddenly seemed possible. What's the catch? I asked. David smiled. Smart question. The catch is that I expect a 15% annual return on my investment, and I want monthly financial reports. If the restaurant isn't profitable within 18 months, we revisit the partnership terms. Maria had been quiet during most of this exchange, but now she leaned forward. Marcus, this is a good offer. David's invested in successful restaurants before. He knows what he's doing. I looked between them, realizing that my crazy plan was rapidly becoming real. I need to think about it. Of course, but don't think too long. I leave for Seattle tomorrow afternoon. David handed me his business card. One more thing, have you actually talked to Tony about selling? The question I'd been dreading. Not yet. Then that's your homework. None of this matters if Tony isn't interested. That afternoon, I found myself standing outside Bella Vista an hour before my shift started, trying to work up the courage to have the most important conversation of my life. The restaurant looked different from the outside somehow, not just a place where I worked, but a potential future. Tony was in his office, reviewing invoices with the intense concentration he brought to everything. At 65, he still worked 60-hour weeks and knew every detail of the restaurant's operations. Marcus, he looked up as I knocked on his open door. You're early. Everything okay? You seemed upset the other night. Tony, can we talk? About the restaurant, I mean. About your plans. Something in my tone must have caught his attention because he set down his paperwork and gave me his full focus. What kind of plans? I took a deep breath. Are you thinking about selling Bella Vista? Tony was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. That's an interesting question. Why are you asking? Because I want to buy it. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Tony's expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been amusement. You want to buy my restaurant, he said finally. Yes. Marcus, you're a server. A good server. Don't get me wrong, but buying a restaurant, that's a big step. I pulled out my business plan and set it on his desk. I've been thinking about this for days. I know Bella Vista better than anyone except you. I know its strengths, its weaknesses, its potential for growth." Tony picked up the folder but didn't open it. What brought this on? I found myself telling him about the dinner with my family, about David's dismissive comments, about the anger and determination that had been building for days. But as I talked, I realized the story was bigger than that. I've been coasting, Tony. For 3 years, I've been telling myself I was happy just working here, but the truth is, I was scared. Scared of taking risks, scared of failing, scared of trying to build something and having it fall apart. Tony nodded slowly. Fear can be a prison. My brother thinks I'm just a waiter. Maybe I am, but I want to be more than that. Tony opened the folder and began reading. The only sound in the office was the distant clatter of prep work from the kitchen and the occasional car passing outside. I watched his face as he reviewed my projections, my plans for expansion, my analysis of the restaurant's current performance. "This is thorough," he said after several minutes. "Your lunch expansion strategy is smart. I've been thinking about that for years, but never had the energy to implement it." He looked up at me. "Where would you get the financing?" I told him about the bank pre-approval, about David Chen's investment offer, about the partnerships I was building. With each detail, Tony's expression grew more serious. "You've really thought this through." "I have." Tony closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "Marcus, I'm going to tell you something I haven't told anyone except my wife. We've been talking about moving to Arizona for 2 years. Our daughter just had our first grandchild, and Maria wants to be closer to family." My heart started beating faster. "But I built this place from nothing. It's not just a business to me, it's my legacy. I've turned down 3 different offers in the past year because none of those buyers understood what Bella Vista really is." He stood up and walked to the window overlooking the dining room, where Sarah and 2 other servers were setting up for the evening service. "If I sell to you, I know the restaurant will be in the hands of someone who cares about it, someone who understands that it's not just about profit margins and efficiency reports. Does that mean—" Tony turned back to me, a slow smile spreading across his face. "It means let's talk numbers." We spent the next 2 hours going over every aspect of the potential sale. Tony's asking price was $850,000, higher than I'd hoped, but within the range David Chen had mentioned. More importantly, Tony was willing to owner finance part of the deal, which would significantly reduce my bank loan requirements. "If we do this," Tony said as we wrapped up, "I want a 60-day transition period. I'll stay on as a consultant to help you learn the business side, payroll, scheduling, vendor relationships, all the things you haven't had to deal with as a server." "Tony, I found myself at a loss for words. "Don't thank me yet. Running a restaurant is the hardest thing you'll ever do. Ask me in a year if you still think I did you a favor." As I drove home that evening, I called David Chen and accepted his investment offer. Then I called Maria to tell her the news. Then I called Jake to start the legal paperwork. By the time I reached my apartment, I had voicemails from Janet at the bank, 2 restaurant equipment suppliers, and Professor Chen, who had somehow heard about my conversation with Tony through Portland's interconnected restaurant community. But I didn't return any of the calls immediately. Instead, I sat in my car outside my building and called my parents. "Marcus?" Mom's voice was worried. "Is everything okay? You left so suddenly the other night." "Everything's fine, Mom. Better than fine, actually. I have some news." I told them about Tony's willingness to sell, about the financing I'd arranged, about the transition plan we'd developed. There was a long silence when I finished. "You're buying the restaurant?" Dad's voice was carefully neutral. "Yes, that's wonderful, sweetheart," Mom said, though she sounded more worried than excited. "Are you sure you're ready for something like this?" "I'm sure." Another pause. "Then, Dad, what does David think about all this?" I smiled, looking up at the city lights reflected in my car's windshield. "David doesn't know yet, but he will soon." In exactly 3 days, I would walk into our next family dinner not as just a waiter, but as the owner of one of Portland's most respected restaurants. The thought terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. Sunday arrived with the kind of crisp winter clarity that made Portland's mountains visible from downtown. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror in my apartment, adjusting my tie for the 3rd time. Tonight was the night. Exactly 1 week after David's humiliating comments, I would walk into another family dinner with news that would change everything. The past 3 days had been a whirlwind of paperwork, phone calls, and sleepless nights. The purchase agreement was signed, pending final loan approval. David Chen's investment was secured with contracts reviewed by 2 different lawyers. Tony had agreed to announce the sale to staff tomorrow, positioning it as his retirement plan rather than my hostile takeover. But none of that mattered as much as the conversation I was about to have with my family. I arrived at my parents' house in southeast Portland at exactly 6 p.m., the same time I'd arrived for family dinners since I was old enough to drive. The modest 2-story house where I'd grown up looked exactly the same. Mum's flower garden dormant for winter, Dad's truck parked in the driveway next to David's Tesla. "Marcus!" Mum opened the door before I could knock, enveloping me in one of her fierce hugs. "I'm so glad you came. I was worried after last week." "Everything's fine, Mum." Dad appeared in the hallway behind her, his expression cautiously optimistic. "Good to see you, son." David and Jennifer were already in the living room, David scrolling through his phone, while Jennifer flipped through a real estate magazine. They looked exactly like what they were: successful, comfortable, slightly bored with family obligations. "Marcus," David glanced up briefly, "glad you decided to join us. I was afraid you were still sulking about last week." I settled into Dad's old recliner, the same spot I'd occupied during family gatherings for 20 years. "Not sulking. I've been busy." "Busy with what? Extra shifts at the restaurant?" David's tone was casual, but I caught the slight smirk that accompanied the question. "Something like that." Dinner proceeded normally for the first hour. Mum had made her famous pot roast. Dad told stories about his latest construction projects, and Jennifer updated everyone on their house hunting for a vacation property in Bend. David dominated most of the conversation as usual, talking about a promotion opportunity at Nike and their plans for a European vacation. "We're thinking about spending a month in Italy this summer," Jennifer said, cutting her meat with precise movements. "David's been working so hard lately, he deserves a real break." "A month?" Mom sounded impressed. "That sounds wonderful." "It should be. We're planning to stay at some of the best resorts, maybe do some wine tours in Tuscany." David leaned back in his chair with satisfaction. "The benefits of having a real career, you know, being able to afford the finer things in life." The comment hung in the air, clearly directed at me. This was my opening. "Speaking of careers," I said, setting down my fork, "I have some news to share." The table went quiet. Mom looked nervous, Dad curious, and David mildly interested in the way someone might be interested in a moderately amusing story. "I'm changing jobs," I continued. "Finally," David said. "What are you going to do? Hotel management? Maybe work your way up to restaurant manager somewhere?" "Actually, I'm going to own a restaurant." The silence that followed was profound. Jennifer stopped chewing. Mom's eyes widened. Dad leaned forward slightly. David's expression didn't change immediately, as if his brain was processing information that didn't quite make sense. "Own," Mom repeated. "I'm buying Bella Vista. The sale finalizes this week." Now David's expression changed. His casual superiority evaporated, replaced by confusion and something that might have been alarm. "You're buying... Wait, what?" "Bella Vista, the restaurant where I work. Tony's retiring, and I'm purchasing the business from him." "With what money?" David's voice was sharp now, all pretense of casual interest abandoned. I pulled out the folder I'd been carrying and set it on the table between the dinner plates. I've secured financing through Pacific Northwest Bank and a private investor. The purchase price is $850,000. The numbers seemed to echo in the quiet dining room. Jennifer's magazine slipped from her hands. Dad whistled softly under his breath. $850,000, David repeated slowly. You're buying a restaurant for $850,000. That's correct. David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is insane. Marcus, you can't just decide to buy a restaurant because you got your feelings hurt. I didn't decide because my feelings were hurt. I decided because it's a smart business opportunity. Smart business opportunity? David's voice was rising. You're a waiter. You don't know anything about running a business. I opened the folder and pulled out my business plan, the same document that had impressed David Chen, Janet Martinez, and Professor Chen. Actually, I know quite a lot. I've spent 3 years learning every aspect of Bella Vista's operations. I know the profit margins on every menu item, the labor costs for each shift, the seasonal variations in revenue. I know which suppliers offer the best prices and which staff members contribute most to customer satisfaction. David grabbed the business plan and started flipping through it, his expression growing more agitated with each page. Financial projections, market analysis, competitive assessment. He looked up at me with something approaching panic. Where did this come from? I wrote it. You wrote this? Every word. Mom had been silent through this exchange, but now she spoke quietly. Marcus, are you sure about this? It seems like such a big risk. All good things involve risk, Mom. But this isn't reckless. I've done my homework. Dad was examining the contract documents I'd spread on the table. These numbers look solid, son. Your projected revenue growth is conservative, which is smart. He looked up at me with something I hadn't seen from him before. Professional respect. You've really thought this through. That's impossible, David said, still clutching my business plan. A week ago, you were taking my dinner order. Now you're telling me you've arranged $1 million business acquisition. $850,000, I corrected. And yes, that's exactly what I'm telling you. David sat back down heavily, staring at the documents spread across the table. Who's your private investor? David Chen. He owns restaurants in Seattle and specializes in food service investments. David Chen. Jennifer spoke for the first time since my announcement. I know that name. He was profiled in Portland Business Journal last year. His restaurant group is worth millions. The confirmation seemed to hit David like a physical blow. He'd gone pale, and his hands were shaking slightly as he continued reading through my business plan. This can't be real, he muttered. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the photos I'd taken of the signed contracts. Tony announced it to the staff this afternoon. We're planning a soft opening under new management next month. Tony Marcelli is selling to you? Dad asked. That's quite an endorsement, Marcus. Tony's been in the restaurant business for 40 years. He believes in the expansion plan I've developed. Lunch service, private dining events, enhanced wine program, social media marketing. There's a lot of untapped potential. David was quiet for a long moment, still studying the business plan. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed again, from disbelief to something I couldn't quite read. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke. Mom gasped softly. Dad raised his eyebrows. Jennifer looked between us with obvious confusion. Last week I said some things that were... David paused, seeming to struggle with the words. I was wrong about you, about your job, about your potential, about everything. David, I started. No, let me finish. He set down the business plan and looked directly at me. I've always seen you as my little brother who needed protection, needed guidance. It never occurred to me that you were choosing your own path, building towards something bigger. The anger I'd been carrying for a week began to soften. I wasn't building toward anything, David. Not until you called me just a waiter. That's when I realized I'd been settling for less than I was capable of. So this is my fault. I considered the question seriously. Maybe, but not in a bad way. Maybe I needed someone to push me, to make me prove to myself that I could do more. David laughed, a shaky sound somewhere between relief and disbelief. So you bought a restaurant to prove me wrong? I bought a restaurant to prove myself right. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of questions, congratulations, and detailed discussions about my business plan. Dad wanted to know about my marketing strategy. Mom worried about the stress and long hours. Jennifer asked intelligent questions about cash flow and profit margins that surprised everyone, including David. But it was David's reaction that mattered most to me. As the evening progressed, his initial shock transformed into something like admiration. He asked detailed questions about my financing strategy, offered suggestions for business software, and even volunteered to help with some of the legal paperwork through his corporate connections. You know, he said as we were clearing the dinner table, I've been thinking about starting my own consulting business for years, but I've never had the courage to leave Nike. You just leaped into entrepreneurship with both feet. Terrifying, isn't it? Absolutely terrifying. Also incredibly impressive. As I drove home that night, I thought about the week that had changed my life. 7 days ago, I'd been just a waiter, hurt, embarrassed, and angry. Tonight, I was a restaurant owner with a solid business plan, reliable financing, and the support of my family. But more than that, I was someone who had stopped settling for less than he was capable of achieving. My phone rang as I pulled into my apartment complex. The caller ID showed Tony's number. Marcus, I hope it's not too late to call. I wanted to let you know, I just got off the phone with the reviewer from Portland Monthly. She wants to do a feature story about Bella Vista's transition to new ownership. Really? Really? She's particularly interested in the angle of a server becoming an owner. Apparently, it's unusual enough to be newsworthy. I laughed, thinking about David's reaction to seeing his waiter brother featured in Portland's premier business magazine. That sounds perfect, Tony. Oh, and Marcus, welcome to the scariest, most rewarding business in the world. I hope you're ready for the ride. As I hung up and walked toward my apartment, the same studio apartment David had mocked just a week ago, I realized I was ready, more than ready. I was exactly where I was supposed to be.